Welcome to part 3 of the lecture then. And in this last section we're going to be looking at some of the other texts that I've talked about on the lecture already. Those will start with demonology. So if you move on to the next slide, you can see an extract from King James's own demonology. We've thought about his experience with the witches of North Berwick and his delight in their interrogation. What did he make of it? In 1597 he publishes a book called Demonology, the theory of witchcraft, the theory of demons, the theory of otherworldly beings, if you like, in which he explains the way that this experience with witches, he doesn't really mention it in the course of demonology, but it's clearly influenced his thinking. The way that this earlier episode in his life, the personal encounter with witchcraft, has shaped his thinking about the relationships between God and the devil, witches and kings, witches and other magistrates, so the other officials that the king appoints, ideas of order and authority on the one hand, and chaos and misrule on the other. You can see all of these themes running through all of the texts this week. This is why I want you to think about intertextuality. And here we can see demonology bringing them together. And one of the interesting things about demonology is it is written like a play. It's in the form of a dialogue. So we have two characters debating James's ideas here. The first one says, what is their power against the magistrate? So he wants to know what it is that witches can do against a magistrate. And a magistrate can be anybody from a justice of the peace or a local landed official, right the way through to the king himself, who is also a magistrate. And the person who is speaking to him, epistemon, which means knowledge, says, less or greater, according as he, and it is of course always he, deals with them. For if he be slothful towards them, God is very able to make them instruments to waken and punish his sloth. But if he be the contrary, so if he's harsh with them, if he's quick to deal with them, if he's a keen magistrate, if it's the contrary, he, according to the just law of God and allowable law of all nations, will be diligent in examining and punishing of them. God will not permit their master to trouble or hinder so good a work. But if, this is written in Scottish dialect, they be once in hands and ferments, so they be arrested and shut up. Have they any further power? Says the questioner. No, indeed, that is according to the form of their detention. If they be but apprehended and detained by any private person, upon any private respects, their power, no doubt, either in escaping or in doing hurt, is no less nor ever it was before. But, and this is the important part, if on the other part their apprehending and detention be by the lawful magistrate, upon the just respect of their guiltiness in that craft, their power is then no greater than before that ever they meddled with their master being the devil. For where God begins justly to strike by his lawful lieutenants, it is not in the devil's power to defraud or bereave him of the office or effect of his powerful and revenging sceptre. Interesting that we end with an image of a sceptre. Only kings hold sceptres. James is thinking about himself and he's thinking about kings. He's thinking about royal authority. In this case, masculine royal authority very clearly. The king as magistrate. If a witch is apprehended by any ordinary bod, you or me, nothing will happen. They'll have just as much power as they had before. But if they're apprehended, if they're put in prison, if they're arrested by somebody who is a lawful magistrate, the chosen king, the rightful king, the real heir, not a usurper, not some other person, some lordling, somebody who thinks they might want to be king. Again, thinking about themes from Macbeth popping up here. If they're apprehended by the true monarch, then it's all good, isn't it? Their power completely disappears. Kings are an antidote to witches. They are the direct inverse of each other, just as kings and devils were seen earlier to be the inverse of each other. If one is the problem, the other is the solution. It's really interesting, isn't it, how it breaks down into these binary divisions. And I do think one of the things that Macbeth does very strongly is echo this, but also problematise it, because we have usurpers flourishing for a good part of the play of Macbeth. Yeah, okay, he comes to a sticky end, but there is an awful lot of sympathy for Macbeth, who is the great speaker, the great fantastical imaginer of the play. You know, how far do we go along with this anti-hero, this usurper, this false king? The illustration that I've put on the next slide is also important here. It turns up in News from Scotland. pamphlet that we were talking about earlier, it's actually a version of a woodcut from a previous witchcraft pamphlet. But I think it sums up the kind of things we've been talking about with regard to masculine authority and its power over witchcraft. Here we see on a stage or dais two figures, one of whom is pointing at a group of kneeling women, the other of whom is pulling a fur cloak around him and sitting on a rather throne-like seat, and is watching what this other man is doing and watching what the witches are doing. Finally, a third man is holding up a stick above the women, appears to be about to hit them with it. There's all sorts going on here. We have the idea that the hand in the very middle of the woodcut, in the very middle of the image drawing our eye, is pointing instructively to this group of women and saying, these witches, you must get rid of them. You know, these are the people that are undermining our communities, damaging our polities, emptying out our realm and causing harm to our neighbours. We must get rid of them. This man is an authority figure. He stands tall in the middle of the image. He's well dressed, like the man next to him. The man next to him, interestingly, looks a little bit, he's drawing back, his arms are crossed, so he's sort of holding himself, he's defending himself from these witches. There were some reasons for that in the original woodcut made in 1579. This man, who in the original story from 1579, is sick. But in this image, when this occurs in News from Scotland, this does appear meant to represent the king. There he is, although he's drawing back from the witches, yet he is also protected from them. And this figure stood to the side of him is helping him identify them and get rid of them. They're being beaten by the other man, our enforcer, down here in the lower corner. And the witches are kneeling, they're looking at each other. They're very homogenised as a group, aren't they? They're a kind of Sabbath or coven of witches in their own right. These kind of visual images are really important too. When you see the play of Macbeth, and think about the ways in which images of witchcraft are starting to become important. We talked last week about other woodcuts and ways in which visual imagery of witchcraft is really key to understanding how it works. When you look at this kind of image, think about how that is working alongside the play. There are some complicating factors though. Just as in the woodcut, the man in the throne or chair looks a little bit weaker than we might expect from a rightful king because he's based on this earlier figure, the sick man. So the play of Macbeth and its sources have some rather different things to say about witchcraft than we might expect. It's not actually quite as simple as James's demonology makes it appear. And that's one of the reasons why I think Macbeth tends to escape from that simple binary division between witches on the one hand and kings on the other. One of the original sources is important here, and also the early productions of Macbeth are important. An astrologer called Simon Forman went to see a very early production of Macbeth in 1610, and he reported back on it, which is absolutely brilliant. We have an eyewitness testimony, supposedly, from the first not season of Macbeth, but from the first series of performances of Macbeth in about 1610 or 1611. Remember, it's been around since about 1606. This is what Forman says he saw. There was to be observed first how Macbeth and Banquo, two noblemen of Scotland, riding through a wood, there stood before them three women, fairies or nymphs. Oh, well, that's different, isn't it? He doesn't say witches. And there saluted Macbeth, saying 3 times to him, Hail Macbeth, King of Codon. He's misremembered the name of the place he's king of. For thou shalt be a king, but thou shalt beget no king, etc. And then Banquo, what, all to Macbeth and nothing to me? Yes, said the nymphs, Hail to thee, Banquo, thou shalt beget kings, yet be no king. It's almost a direct quote from the play, isn't it? And so they departed and came to the court of Scotland, to Duncan, King of Scots, and it was in the days of Edward the Confessor. So we have a little bit of historical context there. But they're nymphs or fairies. That's interesting. What did he see on the stage? It's been argued that maybe he's remembering rather more than the production itself, the earlier source that we can find for Shakespeare's Macbeth, which is Raphael Holinshead Chronicles from 1577. He's drawing on earlier chroniclers, but it seems that this is perhaps the first text that Shakespeare looked at, chronologically speaking, that inspired Macbeth. And Holinshead is very confused about what these figures that Macbeth and Banquo meet out in the wilds of Scotland are. This is what he has to say. Is Forman thinking back to this rather than saying, I saw on the stage in 1610 some characters that didn't look like witches to me, they look like fairies or nymphs. Is he rather thinking, I once read a book by Raphael Holinshead and he said that they were something other than witches? This is what Holinshead has to say. It fortuned, as Macbeth and Banquo journeyed towards Forres, where the king then lay, they went sporting by the way together without other company, save only themselves, passing through the woods and fields, and suddenly in the midst of a lawn or a kind of open area, a clearing, there met them 3 women in strange and wild apparel, resembling creatures of elder world, whom, when they attentively beheld, wondering much at the sight, the first of them spake and said, All hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis, for he had lately entered into that dignity and office by the death of his father Sinel. Shakespeare almost quotes Holinshead there. Again, this idea of textual dialogue, intertextuality is really important. The second of them said, Hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor. But the third said, All hail Macbeth, that hereafter shall be King of Scotland. Then Banquo, What manner of women, saith he, are you, that seem so little favourable unto me, whereas my fellow here, besides high offices, you assign also the kingdom, appointing forth nothing to me at all? Yes, said the first of them, we promise greater benefits unto thee than unto him, for he shall reign indeed, but with an unlucky end, neither shall he leave any issue behind him to succeed in his place, where, contrarily, thou indeed shalt not reign at all. But of thee those shall be born which shall govern the Scottish kingdom by long order of continual descent. Shakespeare has a considerably snappier version of that in Macbeth, doesn't he? Herewith the 4 said women vanished immediately out of their sight. This was reputed at the first, but some vain fantastical illusion, there's that word again, by Macbeth and Banquo, insomuch that Banquo called Macbeth in jest King of Scotland. He doesn't call them witches. He doesn't call them nymphs or fairies either, but he does suggest that they are something of elder world, which is a fairy term. That's something about an other world. Later on, Holinshead does talk about witches, and he also goes back to that earlier scene that he's created for us, and he says something about fairies. This is why people have suggested Foreman might be remembering this. Macduff builds a castle, later on in the story of these people, and shortly after, Macbeth coming to behold how the work went forward, and because he found not Macduff there, he was sore offended, and said, I perceive this man will never obey my commandments, till he be ridden with a snaffle, so like a horse being ridden with a really harsh bit. But I shall provide well enough for him. Neither could he afterwards abide to look upon the said Macduff, either for that he thought his puissance, his power, over great, either else for that he had learned of certain wizards. That's interesting. In his words he put great confidence, for the prophecy had happened so right, which the 3 fairies, or weird sisters, there's Shakespeare's phrase, had declared unto him, how that he ought to take heed of Macduff, who in time to come should seek to destroy him. And surely hereupon had he put Macduff to death, but a certain witch, whom he had in great trust, had told that he should never be slain with man born of any woman, nor vanquished till the wood of Burn and came to the castle of Dunsinane. The various bits of the prophecy are all split up here, aren't they? There's some wizards who don't turn up in the play. There are 3 fairies who also don't turn up in the play, but there is a lot of debate about what those witches, or, as Shakespeare chooses from Holinshead, weird sisters, are. They have a certain input into the prophecy, and then there's this certain witch who says, you know, you're not a woman born, you can't be killed until the wood of Burnham comes to Dunsinane, which Shakespeare gives to the weird sisters. There's an awful lot of slippage here. There's an awful lot of confusion about what these creatures are, and that's something that definitely influences the play. But also I think it destabilises the narrative that we've built up so far in the course of this lecture, which is a very binary one. There isn't a massive distinction between witches and kings, partly because the witches don't quite seem to be witches. How far the kings are kings and how far it's possible to tell who the true king, the true magistrate is I think a very fair question once you've looked at Macbeth. And you can also ask questions about what is seen on the stage. The ways that the witches, if they are witches, are portrayed is really important. The stage directions say they're witches, but what do the visuals say? What does First Witch look like? What are these weird sisters? So please take a look at exercise 3 and think about what Reading Foreman's account of this production and Holinshead's source tells us about the understanding of Macbeth's witches. What else are there? What more are there? Could they be nymphs or fairies? Who is in control here, the kings or the witches, and how far are they different from each other?